Mass political repression. Democracy in Europe is disappearing. We are witnessing a trend of democracy marked by blatant suppression in an extremely critical aspect, the oppression of presidential candidates who do not align with globalization. Or in other words, they outright eliminate candidates who don't suit the global elite's agenda. For decades, globalization and progressive ideals reigned supreme, as people hoped for an open, integrated world. But the harsh reality of globalization, from economic instability and uncontrolled immigration waves to policies that sacrifice voters' interests for so-called humanity-serving projects, has shattered public trust. And what has happened? People are turning their backs on the old order. They no longer believe in progressive slogans and are shifting toward nationalist, conservative, populist movements. Movements that promise to protect their real interests, not chase after lofty global ideals. What is the Western establishment's response to this awakening? They don't debate, they suppress. Look at the reality. The West once prided itself as a beacon of democracy, freedom, and justice. But now, they're sinking into the darkness of the very actions they once condemned. They imprison candidates with high approval ratings in polls. They ban movements that challenge the old order. They silence the voices of millions, all under the belief that repression will keep them firmly on their throne of power. From Pakistan's prisons to Europe's courtrooms, the elite are desperately clinging to power by jailing opponents, crushing dissent, and stifling opposing voices, all with the conviction that suppressing populist far-right political rivals will keep them at the pinnacle of globalization, representing the elite's authority. But will their willingness to discard the democratic freedoms they once preached keep them at the top? Let's look at some prominent examples. Pakistan, a nucleus of instability. Imran Khan, former Prime Minister of Pakistan, has been detained since August 2023, standing as proof of the ruling elite's fear of an unyielding opponent. A cricket legend, Khan left behind fame to enter politics with a promise to reform Pakistan's corrupt system. Taking power in 2018, he confronted the military and corrupt politicians head-on, earning the fervent support of millions. People believed in him, not because of empty promises, but because they saw a real chance to lift a nation of 250 million out of the mire. But that very support made him a target. Early in his tenure, Khan maintained friendly ties with the West, especially cooperating in the fight against terrorism. But by 2021, he began criticizing the US for meddling in Pakistan's internal affairs. By 2022, he openly leaned toward Russia and China, even visiting Moscow as Russia launched its campaign in Ukraine. Soon after, he was ousted by a coalition of the military and political groups he had investigated for corruption. Since then, he's been trapped in an endless cycle of repression. When one sentence is overturned, another emerges, a chain of injustices designed to keep him behind bars. Yet even in prison, Khan remains a thorn in the establishment's side. They know that if released, he'd return to punish those who overthrew him and reform a nuclear-armed nation. The charges against him are widely criticized as fabricated. Khan, once considered for a Nobel Peace Prize and a potential chancellor of Oxford University, heightens the fears of his captors. They don't just fear what he's done, they dread what he could do if freed. So they pile on accusations to keep him locked away. Pakistan's military and political elite confidently ignore Western protests, knowing the West has weakened itself. What's happening in Pakistan mirrors how the West treats its own political rivals. And so the West stays largely silent, no longer credible enough to criticize. Why? Because Europe itself is now on the brink of losing the democracy it once proudly championed. The picture in Europe is even bleaker. In Romania, Călin Georgescu, the leading candidate in the first round of the 2024 presidential election, was abruptly disqualified from the political race by a surprise legal ruling. Accused of being a Moscow influencer, a familiar label lacking convincing evidence, he's been barred from the new election slated for May 2025. The real reason? He opposed EU domination, calling for Romania to reclaim economic sovereignty and break free from Brussels' control. Georgescu repeatedly criticized the EU's interference in Romania's internal policies, from natural resources to strategic industries, advocating for a more independent path rather than submission to Western dictates. That stance made him a threat. Polls showed he'd win in the first round, but that didn't matter to Romania's elite. They were willing to nullify the election, ignoring outrage both domestically and from Western allies. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance publicly condemned the move, calling it a disgrace to democracy. But his criticism changed nothing. Romania's leadership, under intense EU pressure, pressed forward. Because the EU cannot tolerate a true democracy in Romania, where election results might undermine their regional dominance. They fear that if Romanians truly had a choice, they could elect an independent government unwilling to bow to Brussels, shaking the EU's influence in the country. In France, the situation grows even graver, with a politically motivated ruling against Marine Le Pen, aimed at barring her from the 2027 presidential race. As leader of the National Rally, RN, she's emerged as a top contender, backed by citizens fed up with the Paris elite. Rather than face her in a fair election, the system has weaponized the law to block her candidacy. This verdict doesn't just reflect discrimination, it's a deliberate strategy by French authorities, especially since she represents a far-right populist ideology that threatens their stability and power. I've also made a video analyzing Le Pen's case. You can check it out for a deeper dive into the story. You don't have to agree with her or her party. But if the EU truly upheld the rule of law and equality, this verdict would raise serious questions when compared to Christine Lagarde, now president of the European Central Bank. In 2008, as France's finance minister, Lagarde made a controversial decision to transfer 403 million euros of public funds to a businessman in a bank lawsuit, a move many deemed wrongful. Yet when the case went to court, Lagarde faced no punishment, despite a negligence conviction. Why? Her international reputation and role in the global financial crisis shielded her. The contrast is stark. Christine Lagarde, despite a grave error costing over 400 million euros in unrecoverable damage, was protected by her global prestige and position in the power structure. Meanwhile, Marine Le Pen, a leading candidate with strong public support, faces a harsh sentence banning her from elections over a 4.4 million euro issue, with damages up to 5 million euros. This shows France's legal system doesn't dispense justice evenly. Instead, it uses legal maneuvers to safeguard the political interests of the elite, eliminating unwanted rivals regardless of their influence. In Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, party is facing a serious threat, not just from direct opposition by political rivals, but also from legal and political measures that could be used to halt their rise. Just a decade ago, AfD was a small, isolated party. Now it has surged to become Germany's second strongest political force, trailing the CDU-CSU coalition by only 3.5% in recent polls. Their dramatic rise is no accident. It's the result of prolonged failures by traditional parties to address pressing issues like immigration, economic crises, and national identity. In particular, AfD has gained strong support from citizens who feel abandoned by the current government, and those who demand stricter immigration policies and measures to protect German cultural identity. However, instead of facing AfD in fair political competition, Germany's elite are considering legal measures to curb the party, labeling them with damning terms like extremist and unconstitutional. These are heavy accusations, wielded as a tool to undermine AfD's political standing and diminish their influence among the public. As a result, while AfD has secured victories in some regions, especially in local elections, they've been unable to break into major coalitions or achieve significant success in the latest national election. This doesn't just reflect their failure to expand influence. It could also spark a deep political crisis in the heart of Europe. Germany's political system, built on democratic values and freedom, will face profound changes if these restrictive measures persist. The accusations of extremism and unconstitutionality against AfD largely stem from statements and policies by party leaders deemed too radical or incompatible with Germany's constitutional principles by their political opponents. Calls to restrict immigration from non-EU countries, especially Muslim-majority nations, or their advocacy for nationalism and fierce opposition to EU policies, are often criticized as threats to Germany's multicultural and integrative foundation. Yet many AfD supporters argue these positions reflect legitimate concerns about issues the current government has ignored. Using legal measures to limit AfD doesn't just harm the political rights of a large swath of voters. It sends a powerful message. Conservative forces or parties that defy the political elite will have no real chance to participate in the political process. This could set a dangerous precedent for other political parties across Europe, giving governments and political forces an easy way to sideline opponents without facing legitimate challenges. Such a scenario isn't just the suppression of a single party. It's a degradation of democracy itself, where the people's right to choose is undermined by political and legal tactics. The threat to AfD highlights a clash between opposing political ideologies and democratic values as parties vie for influence and power. But history shows that repression is a double-edged sword. From Pakistan's prisons to Europe's courtrooms, the elite are desperately clinging to power, jailing opponents, crushing dissent, and silencing disagreement, all under the delusion that suppression will keep them on top. But these very actions are destroying Western democracy, each crackdown driving another nail into their own coffin. From Imran Khan in the East to Marine Le Pen in Europe, this isn't just about individual fates. It's about the inevitable collapse of a system rotting from within. The West once prided itself as a beacon of freedom and democracy. Now it's mimicking tactics it once condemned in authoritarian regimes. From imprisoning Imran Khan in Pakistan to disqualifying Georgescu in Romania, banning Le Pen in France, and threatening AfD in Germany, a chilling pattern emerges. The elite no longer trust the system they built. They fear the rise of popularly backed leaders, those who dare to challenge the status quo and voice truths that millions feel but aren't allowed to say. In their panic, they choose repression, but it's a suicidal weapon. Each act of suppression stabs at public trust. When voters see their favored candidates banned, imprisoned, or smeared, they stop believing in the ballot. The legitimacy of those in power crumbles, and that void is quickly filled with rage. The forces the elite brand as extremist or anti-democratic become voices of truth for millions stripped of their choice. They tell voters, the establishment no longer plays by the rules, so why should we respect them? And people don't just listen, they act. When the people's will reaches a breaking point, a revolution is inevitable. Whether it simmers quietly or erupts explosively, change driven by the times is certain, especially when freedom serving the oligarchs strip more and more from the people. The consequences are irreversible for the Western elite who worship an imposed form of democracy. History spares no mercy for those who destroy themselves. In Pakistan, repression can't stop the support for Imran Khan. Each day he's imprisoned only fuels public backing. Protests in his favor persist, whether driven by political motives or genuine support. His detention continues to be contested, turning him into a symbol of defiance. In France, Marine Le Pen may be barred from running, but her movement won't die. The backlash won't fade. It's the trend of the era. The French people, fed up with the arrogance of the Paris elite and globalist plans that chip away at their livelihoods, will find a way to elevate her, or her successor, to power. In Germany, if AfD is banned, it won't vanish. It'll reborn in a new, stronger form, fueled by the fury of a betrayed nation. The tighter the West grips, the faster it hastens its own downfall. The elite fail to see they're not just fighting individuals like Khan, Le Pen, or Georgescu. They're battling an unstoppable historical tide. By eliminating rivals, they don't protect their power. They hand it to the very forces they fear most. A crisis is coming. No ruling, no prison can stop it. Europe's elite and the broader West are writing their own death sentence, and the time to fix it has run out. Look at what's happening. In Italy, where anti-system forces once won, but were swiftly tamed by Brussels. In Austria, where the Freedom Party is isolated despite strong votes. Across Europe, where traditional parties form coalitions just to block change. But these tactics no longer work. The people have awakened, and they won't be silenced. Repression isn't the answer, it's the catalyst for a revolution the elite can't control. Conclusion: an inevitable future. The West stands on the brink of an irreversible shift. The elite may keep pushing globalist policies, imprisoning, banning, and slandering, but they can't halt history's march. The globalization they chase is backfiring, harming the very people they should serve. In a new multipolar world, focusing solely on expanding the power and profits of a select few, while ignoring the legitimate rights of the masses, is no longer sustainable. Imran Khan may reclaim Pakistan's premiership. Marine Le Pen or her successor will lead France, and AfD will break its isolation to reshape Germany's future. These aren't far-fetched predictions. They're realities forming before our eyes. The people, ignored and sidelined for years, are rising to reclaim their rights. They're no longer afraid, no longer willing to accept a system that protects only the interests of a distant, powerful few. The Western elite may try to crush their challengers, but this resistance isn't just a grab for power. It's a revolution of will. This fight no longer belongs to politicians, it belongs to the people, who've realized they can't live under an outdated system where their needs are sacrificed for global calculations. The West is destroying itself. The cost won't just be the fall of a few politicians. It'll be the unraveling of an order that stood for centuries. The hour of judgment is approaching fast, and nothing can stop the awakening of a people rising to claim their place in a multipolar world where they've been forgotten for too long.